How to Tell a Story, a book by Mark Twain. Twain distinguishes between a humorous and a comic story to explain the factors that should be considered when telling a story. In his book How to Write a Story, he cites the points necessary for making your audience laugh their breath away. There are many kinds of stories, but he chooses to base them on humorous and comic stories, saying first and foremost that they are different in the sense that the former is American, whereas the latter is English. Twain talks about the humorous story, making it sound like the best kind of story. For instance, he says that the humorous story applies simplicity in its narration, that the storyteller tells the story simply and innocently, and tends to amuse the listeners without even having to pinpoint the point of laughter directly. It might be longer than a comic story but meanders around the central point gently in an artistic manner that, at the end of it all, the listeners are able to get amused by listening to paragraphs full of jargon just to make the audience understand the nub in his story. The humorous story that employs the tonal variation style quickly catches the listener's attention, making them realize a funny thing in the speaker's story before the speaker realizes it deserves applause. Thus, the factor of being natural when telling a story is clearly brought out. This helps your audience build up attention because they know you are naturally funny and can never predict what you will say next. The story should be told in a manner that the point comes last, but still, along the way, the listeners are to burst into laughter without waiting for the ending. It should not be a matter whereby you get the storyteller going around his audience seeking applause by repeating the same point several times for the readers to understand. Another crucial factor is the ability to slur a point. That is, a storyteller should be able to speak indistinctively about the main point so that the listeners don't quickly tell what the teller wants to say before he even says it. Pointing out or saying your lines in easily understandable language makes your story bogus because the listener does not have the difficulty of figuring out what you are saying, thus making it less funny. For a story to be funny, one must involve the audience in creating a mental picture of what is being said so that they get amused after knowing the real meaning of the teller's words. In simple terms, the teller should employ various stylistic devices in his narration that will help him communicate the message clearly. The ability to employ suspense as a narrative technique makes one's story humorous. This happens when you are telling a story, and there is something that you would like your audience not to figure out so quickly. You pause and later continue giving the idea that they were frantically guessing as if you didn't know it. This makes the listeners burst out in laughter because they have actually figured out the wrong idea. Sometimes, it might be embarrassing to them, but just the idea of knowing the answer leads them to cry out of joy. Thus, having a pause that should not be too short or too long finally gives an impressive response, but at the same juncture, a pause that is too long might withdraw the interest and curiosity in your listeners because they will know that a surprise is coming. When narrating a story, the narrator should try to break the monotony of the prose narration, and this might be done by chipping in a studied phrase or a line identified with a particular well-known narrator author. This makes the listeners limit their thoughts in terms of content and think outside the box by comparing and contrasting ideas. This also illustrates the fact that the storyteller is well-versed in content, and especially when the illustration is amusing, the listeners will remove a yelp that might even make them jump out of their shoes. One of the functions of a narrative/story is to entertain, thus, apart from performing other functions like educating, it should be the audience having the urge to listen to another story told by the same narrator. Though Twain tends to explain the above factors as essential in the narration of a story, we see him making errors in the excerpt from Laughing It. Based on the movie adaptation of 2002, we see Twain when invited as the main inspirational speaker during the Bryn Mawr College graduation ceremony. He employs exaggeration just to explain his experiences in the West. This is contrary to what he preaches because exaggeration is something that the narrator should avoid. Instead, he must remain natural by clearly demonstrating their ideas.